But today we're going to be looking at the next few verses of the Sermon on the Mount and discuss the relationship between Jesus and his teachings and the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. And maybe we should just remind ourselves where we've been, sort of where we're coming from when we're talking about Matthew. So we've been using Matthew and we're going through Matthew, and I think it's really important to understand what I think his agenda is. Because I think each of the gospel writers has a different agenda that they're trying to portray, they're trying to put out, they're trying to engage with, so that they've got different audiences. So does anybody remember what audience we said Matthew was engaging with? Jewish, yeah. A particular type. The marginalized, outcast, mamzers, we called them. And Matthew asserts that the usual religious status quo does not accurately reflect the nature of the kingdom of God. And the kingdom is primarily concerned with those whom we underestimate and believe do not belong. And that was his emphasis. And while we're here, like I said, well, let's just quickly review the other ones. So anybody remember what we said about Mark? Who was Mark? Well, who was he writing to? Particular set of people? Think of armor, thingy hats. Yeah, someone we had to shout there. Romans, absolutely. He himself was not a Roman, but he was writing to a Roman audience, and it's kind of why I think a lot of people like Mark's gospel, is that because he was writing to this Roman audience, so it's really quick paced until it gets, and because Romans liked action, and I think if you're a bit of an action movie buff, you quite like Mark's gospel because it just jumps one stage to another, and it's just all action until it gets to the crucifixion, and he really wants to draw your attention in, so he slows right down. Luke, who was Luke? Who did we say? So I have a slightly controversial position on Luke, not my own. It's stuff that I've learned and been taught. I'll remind you instead of asking you. So I tend to side with a theologian called Gulda, who's a brilliant theologian, and he says that Luke is probably a Jewish convert. And he's writing a Parsha companion. And actually, you can split up Luke's gospel differently to the way that we do in the West, that actually it hits with it accompanies all the Parsha readings that you would find in a synagogue, because he's wanting to connect Jesus' life and his ministry and his death and resurrection alongside all these Old Testament readings that you would find in in a synagogue. So I think that Luke was probably a priest was an Escon priest. He was a healer who then converted to Judaism and then discovered Jesus and wanted to write this orderly account. And then that leaves us with John. Anybody remember what we said about John? Who was his audience? It's a grafted, it was a mixed audience, and it does this amazing thing where, because people, I find it funny when people say, oh, the disciples were probably uneducated, and then when you dig into this stuff and you find the way that they wrote their gospels in such a way that actually they're speaking into their context in such a beautiful and powerful way that they're talking to these two completely separate audiences at the same time. If you remember, we said that John was the apostle to Asia and Asia Minor, which was an incredibly mixed ecology, around about 20% Jewish, and so the early church there would have been very much this different thing. So when you got the prologue, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and blah blah blah. This all speaks into both the Torah, the Word of God, but also into Greek, very much Greek mindset. And again, that's another reason why we in the West, we kind of like John's gospel, because it's got all this imagery and all this stuff that we really connect with. It always baffles me when people say, to people who are new believers, read John's gospel, it's really easy to understand. And then they hit chapters 6, 7, and 8. And I kind of go like, there is some really deep theology in there that I don't understand, but crack at it. It's why I recommend Mark, because it's action-packed, but there we are. That's my own personal thing. But we're looking at Matthew. We're doing this big deep dive through Matthew, looking at this Mamza agenda. And we began with looking at sort of what he's doing, and we're particularly focusing now at the moment on the Sermon on the Mount. And as Jesus has started to talk publicly, and he's drawing clouds to himself for some bizarre reason, drawing crowds to himself by proclaiming the kingdom. And John the Baptist baptizes him, and he's tested in the desert, and John the Baptist has arrested him, and Jesus takes on the mantle of possibly his rabbi. If you remember, I sort of talked about this last week, sort of didn't because my notes were a mess, but he jumps into this, he picks up John's notion of repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And as he brings the kingdom, it's not just an announcement, but he actually demonstrates the kingdom himself and itself. And people of all kinds start to arrive, and you've got everybody there, people that you would expect to be there, but loads of people that you would not expect to be there. And it causes the disciples this real quandary. It causes them to go oh gosh. And so actually last week we mentioned very briefly that as the disciples would look around, and Jesus pulls them aside and starts saying blessed are the poor in spirit. He's talking to his disciples there. He's not, we sometimes think he's talking to the crowd. Now he may well be as well, but his main audience is his disciples, to say this is what the kingdom looks like. And in response to this, Jesus ascends to a certain mountainside, and he sits down and he notes and sees the crowd, and he says all of this. And so ultimately Jesus says, don't you worry, because this is the kingdom. This is what it's going to look like. This is what it means for you to be salt and light. This is what it means for you to work it out. You will be the hope. And we reference to the hope of the world, because you are bringing the kingdom. And I think sometimes we get a little bit triggered when we hear, I prayed earlier, didn't I? And as we said, the church is the hope of the world, and we kind of good evangelicals go no, that's Jesus. He is. That's not. I'm not saying all that. He's not the hope of the world. But he partners with you and me. He uses you and me to bring his hope. Doesn't he? You are messengers. You are ambassadors. You are the people. You are the bricks. You are the people who build the kingdom. And so you become the hope of one. The same way as what, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He also said, you are the light of the world. People are meant to see your lives and go that's what it means to live with relationship with God. You are bringing shalom to chaos, and the world, this world needs to see this in action. So let's pick up where we left off. So let's start by bringing a little bit of context here. This phrase, I have come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, but I've come to fulfill it. Now, when you're raised with a Christian worldview, what did that term signify to you? You don't need to shout out, but think about it. What does it mean that Jesus came to fulfill the law? I'll give a little pause for you to think. Like I say, you don't need to shout out. I think that sometimes we ignore the part about the law altogether. We kind of go, we're saved by grace. We don't need the law. Rah, 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 rah. You know? Because we always think that this statement is fulfillment of future-telling prophecy. And the way we typically discuss it, it isn't even about the law at all. It's about prophecy. And we merely use the law as a general blanket term to refer to the Old Testament. And I recall when I was growing up that when I was being discipled after coming to faith, that's what was basically conveyed to me. It was in this discussion that Jesus had accomplished everything, and Jesus had accomplished every rule that God laid down. And by the way, as a side note, this doesn't work because Jesus wasn't a woman. So it'd be quite hard for him to accomplish some of the laws because they applied specifically to women. So logically that can't be true. But you know, he came to fulfill this. And so it was conveyed that to me, almost as if the law were a video game, and you kind of pass these different levels, and you've got 613 levels to conquer, and Jesus is the only one who conquered them all and finished them all and triumphed over them all, and he lived a flawless life, managing to conquer and beat them all, and won the video game thing at the end, and so therefore we no longer need to play it. And Jesus came to conquer and win the game for us. That's kind of what we're told. Does that ring any bells? Yeah. And this assumption that if he did so, somehow we would not have to stumble. I'm not quite sure where that idea actually originates from. It doesn't seem to make much logical sense to me, but that's certainly not what Jesus is conveying here. Jesus, the mitzvah, that's the Hebrew term for good deeds or good works or commandments. You might refer to the mitzvah or as plural. The mitzvah, it's not a game show. It's not a challenge to be accepted or completed. It's not like going to your local burger joint where you can eat this whole burger and get your meal for free. You know, like, or wherever food challenge. Like, maybe I watch too much social media because I get hooked onto these food challenge people. That's not what Torah is. That's not what the law is. And this idea needs to be adjusted, and we must adjust it, and as we always do, to its original context. Because when a rabbi talks about fulfilling and abolishing, he means something specific. And when a rabbi says he's fulfilling the Torah, it means that he is interpreting it correctly. And this concept is even larger than we typically convey in our language, because interpretation extends beyond mere mental, intellectual, or theological academic explanations. It's bigger than that. That's only one part of what it means to interpret the law in a rabbinical world. And so you must be able to examine the law, interpret it accurately, and engage in the legal work of interpreting it. And then to fulfill this, you must embody that interpretation in your actions, your behavior, what one might refer to as your walk. And we've discussed the desert before, haven't we? We've discussed this before. The term halak is the Hebrew word, and we walk. Your walk must align with your interpretation. Firstly, you need to interpret it correctly. You know, there is a right or wrong way to understand the scriptures. You'll be pleased to know, or maybe not. Maybe we like the idea that, I've got my truth about how I understand the Bible, and you can have yours, and maybe we can find some common ground. But that's not true. There's a right or wrong way of interpreting this. So firstly, we need to interpret the words correctly. You must interpret it intellectually with precision, and then support it with your behavior and adherence in your walk, which is how you fulfill it. And if you do not follow that process, it is referred to as abolishing. So, for example, you can have perfectly great intellectual theology, but not live it out. And do you know what you're doing? You're abolishing it. You're abolishing it. You can think all the good stuff that you want to think in the world, and you can write academic papers, and you can be a doctor in theology and know all the Greek and Hebrew way better than what I do, and not walk it out. And that's abolishing it. So you can abolish Torah by interpreting it incorrectly, but also you can abolish the law by not walking it out. The thing is that if you misinterpret it, it doesn't matter how you live. So you've got all these people who say like, oh, I don't need God, I'm a good person by myself. And we can probably point to loads and loads and loads and loads of moral people who live great, brilliant lives, but they do not know Jesus. They're not in a relationship with God. And there's a problem there because actually they're abolishing it because they've not interpreted the law correctly. Does that make sense? You've got two ways that you can abolish the law. You can have perfect thinking, but not work it out, or you can work it out and have faulty thinking. Both abolish the law. So when Jesus says, I have come to fulfill Torah, he is expressing that he has come to embrace the books of Moses and the teachings associated with them. And we could even extend this to include the entirety of Tanakh, the whole of the Old Testament. And I've come to engage with Hebrew scriptures, and I've come to live them out correctly. This is what he said, and purely and without mistake before you, so you can see what it means to do this. And if you wish to understand how to interpret the Bible, he's not referring to achieving anything. He's observing the world around him and stating, I'm demonstrating to you how to read the Bible correctly, not only with your mind, though that's part of it. I want you to engage with the Bible correctly, using your mind, and I also want you to apply those teachings to your life. And I'm going to show you. I'm telling you and demonstrating to you how to do that. And that's referred to as fulfillment. Whatever is being achieved here is a fulfillment of Torah, not a rejection. He makes this clear in the following verses, and this involves me demonstrating how to live this correctly. An interpretation of the law with your mind and heart and actions. And it echoes our discussion a fair few months ago about, regarding the heart, the soul, and the experiences in the desert. It's akin to the Shema. Love your Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your everything that you have. And Jesus is saying, I'm teaching you how to embody this fully. This is precisely what is occurring here. And you may be sitting there thinking, oh, well, this is all well and good, Gavin, but whatever. I kind of get your point about the law. He's fulfilling it in a new way. But he says, I do not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them. How do you fulfill a prophet? How does that work? Because that's not like a command. To understand this, we need to reflect on our conversation about the third voice in Isaiah, as it serves as a perfect example. And it exemplifies our question beautifully. We discussed the discourse of the suffering servant, if you remember, back to the third voice in Isaiah. Particularly, we looked at Isaiah 53, which states that he was pierced for our transgressions and struck for our iniquities. By his stripes we are healed. And this entire passage evokes thoughts of Jesus. And in fact, actually, we read this around this time of year, around Easter, don't we? We kind of go, this is it, Isaiah, he knew. But what we've got to remember is that actually, essentially, this passage is primarily not about Jesus, but about Judah, because of how prophecy works. And because if Judah had persisted in their faithfulness, people would have been saved through it. If Judah had been faithful in their suffering, the world would have been saved. However, some 700 years later, Jesus could just easily say to his listeners, look, I'm demonstrating how to live out Isaiah 53. Although he wouldn't have called it Isaiah 53 because I hadn't broken it up into chapters back then, but that's another thing. But he could have said, like, just look at my life. Look at my life. Look at how it is. I'll show you how to live it out, which will ultimately culminate in this beautifully poignant way on the cross. That we kind of go, Isaiah just knew he wasn't talking about the current situation. He just had this momentary glimpse of the future of Jesus on the cross, and so therefore that's what he's talking about. But what we've got to remember is that Jesus' entire ministry, his whole life, will embody the teachings of Isaiah 53. We can just pick a book. What about Amos? What about Amos? And Amos's call for justice to flow. Jesus would say, if you observe me, I will show you how to do that. I will show you how to enact justice. And where do we see that? Well, we see that in when the crowd bring this woman caught in adultery to stone, and it goes like, we're going to stone him. Let's see what Jesus is going to do. Like, is he going to uphold the law? And he just bends down and starts writing in the sand, in the dirt. I mean, and there's loads of sermons out there about what he's writing, if he's writing people's names or people's sins and all this sort of stuff. We don't know. We ain't got a clue. But he just starts writing. And suddenly they drift off. Eldest to youngest drift off and leave him. And it's like, well, what's the justice? The justice there is that this woman who's caught, where's the bloke? If you're going by the law, both of them. But Jesus says, just to go to like, there's no one here accusing you. Well, neither do I. Go and sin no more. A few weeks ago, we discussed Jesus' baptism, and with Jesus saying, I have to do this, John, because why? What were Jesus' words to John? Does anybody remember? To fulfill all righteousness. Now we have some additional pieces, but alongside that, he's saying, I'm doing this to demonstrate what righteousness is to fulfill. And what's it mean to fulfill? It means to demonstrate, to show you, to show the world what it means to live in righteousness. I'm doing this to show you righteousness. And when I take on the waters of baptism, I'm expressing that if you observe my life, you will witness a correct interpretation of obedience to Torah. And consider the prophecy of Amos. Reflect on the teachings from Jonah. And as we've previously discussed, take the prophecy of that. You can choose any of them. Haggai, Habakkuk, any of them. Zechariah. What about the apocalyptic messages and literature of Zechariah? The message seeks to convey to his audience can be observed in the life and ministry of Jesus. And he is the perfect embodiment of the fulfillment of the call of the scriptures. And he states, if you observe me, I will interpret the scriptures accurately. I will show you, not just teach you, and he does that, but he shows us. And we kind of know this, don't we? In all fairness. There's a lot of words to kind of go, we know, don't we? That he's our blueprint and stuff. But we kind of forget sometimes, we kind of go like, and we give all these excuses, go like, oh yeah, well I may not believe that, but at least I'm doing this. Or you may think, but my thinking's right, but I'm doing this, and like it doesn't really matter too much. But actually, we've got to get these things into action. So why does he not talk about the writings? He talks about Torah, but why does he not talk about writing? Why is it only the prophets? Or the law and the prophets? Essentially, the writings weren't necessarily canonized at this point. They were in the process of canonizing what we would refer to as a Ketuvim at this stage in history. And this is only one reference, and it appears much later in one of the other Gospels. And you'll find a reference of Jesus saying the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And I believe some translations actually mention writings. But if you notice, Jesus is just, he uses this as kind of like a catch-all for us. You see, the Psalms and the writings, they exist. Proverbs exists, the book of Esther exists, and the scholars at the time haven't decided whether or not they are canonized, whether they are from the Lord. But I believe it's in Luke 24, and probably verse 44. I've got it referenced here very weirdly. But Luke would say, according to my theory, but the last because that's the last gospel written. I say my theory. It's not my theory. It's somebody else's. It's some scholars that I like. They think Luke's the last one to be written, which is why it has reference to the writings in this passage. Because it says in Luke 24, it says, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." And suddenly you've got this other reference as things come in. So, if Jesus is saying, "I've come to show you how to live out Torah correctly," my question is, why does Jesus make that statement at that point in the Sermon on the Mount? Why does he express that idea? There must be an assumption, and the only reason he would state it in that manner is that there is an assumption that he is actually coming to abolish Torah, to do away with it. So he says, "Do not think I've come to abolish Torah." And that must mean there are people going around, and I can picture them scratching their heads, thinking, okay, so are we supposed to ignore Torah? And now consider what he has just said. Picture this. If the disciples are uncomfortable with the crowd, imagine all the religious people who could be watching, and envision his disciples, if that's who he is addressing directly. Visualize all of them as they observe this diverse crowd with pagans arriving from the Decapolis and from people from the region across the Jordan coming, and all these people. And I don't know, maybe there's even zealots and Sadducees there. All these people, all these different people, and you've got Pharisees in there as well. And you've got this real hodgepodge. And all these people are coming together, and they're saying, well, this isn't right. This isn't what God is doing. And Jesus speaks to his disciples and says, no. All these people are in. And you will bring the kingdom, and you will be the salt and light and the hope of the world by pursuing this declaration of truth. And I think their response is, oh, so I guess what the Bible said isn't what we're doing. Are you discarding the law? Because there's, the way they'd interpret it until that point was incredibly, I can't think of a word now off my hand. But it was like just the Jews were in. Everybody else was outcast. It was very much one nation theology. And Jesus actually says, absolutely not. In fact, quite the opposite. I've come to show you what the law was always intended to convey. I've come to show you what the law was always meant to express. And he is fulfilling it through his interpretation. See, this is a fantastic place to realize that the teachings of Jesus, particularly those we are examining in the Sermon on the Mount, are so radically different that people might be tempted to assume he's discarding Torah or teaching against some of its writing. And Jesus is clarifying that, in fact, he is fulfilling it in his interpretation. And this is a hefty claim. It is a massive claim. Jesus asserts that this is how God has always intended to be interpreted. From the moment that God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai, this is how God intended humanity to read it. This is how they should understand it. This is how we apply it. And obviously, they didn't have the language or knowledge. They were 2,000 years in the past. And however, this is what God's intent has always been, to teach humanity through Torah. And what is it that makes Jesus' interpretation so radical? And I think we've already seen it. What did we say was at the heart of the Beatitudes? Did I land on that last week? If I didn't, apologies. I will tell you in a moment. Am I getting blank faces? Blank faces, that's great. But it's shalom. It's at peace to chaos. That's the heart of the Beatitudes. It's about bringing peace to chaos. It's that the tale of two empire thing that we've seen from the beginning of Scripture. And there are two Beatitudes that rested in the center, and there was a slight hint in the language, and it says, "I have a those who thirst and hunger for righteousness." What was that one that followed? Well, if you hunger and thirst for righteousness, I'll tell you, you find righteousness. You're going to show mercy. That's going to be the response. Jesus' assertion was that righteousness resembles mercy. And he's delivering this message to a world oppressed by the Romans. He's not addressing it to a group of oppressors. He's not there. There isn't a place when don't misinterpret me, but this message is aimed at those on the margins who are being oppressed, who are probably thinking, well, I deserve some mercy. And yet he's saying, you get to bring mercy. You get to show what righteousness worked out looks like. And Jesus, it's a radical message. And he says, you know what this whole kingdom thing looks like? It looks like love. It looks like loving your neighbor. It looks like love for your spouse, and it looks like love for your enemy. It looks like love, it looks like mercy, it looks like forgiveness. This is how the typical person was taught to read Torah in his day. And he's saying, this is how you respond. You're supposed to read it properly. The question is now whether or not we believe Jesus is who he says he was. If he is, then his teachings will give us so much to wrestle with. They will come with an authority that we've never seen in human interpretation. That word authority is actually how I want to close out this message this morning. His teaching of authority. The word for authority is shmika. And it's the term that the Hebrews use in a rabbinical context for authority. And for instance, when Jesus said he's not here to abolish the law but to fulfill it, he goes on to perform exactly that. And if you examine the next section of the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll do next week, I'm not preempting stuff, but we'll do this next week at 9:00. But so if you read ahead in these coming days, you'll discover that he starts to say this really weird phrase over and over again. He'll say, "You've heard it said, but I say unto you. You've heard it said, do not murder, but I say unto you. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say unto you." That is an expression, and that's shmika. And there is much that we do not know about history, and yet we have yet to piece everything together. But the small amount that we do know, along with what appears in the gospel, seems to validate events prior to AD 70. When Akiva established a formal office of rabbi and ordained rabbis. Before this, we had lowercase r rabbis, and we only had teachers. But the formal office of capital R rabbi did not exist until the destruction of the temple. And before that day, you had teachers. But there was this system where where you were prevented from doing any sort of interpretation until you were validated. Validate. Oh, gosh. My mouth's gone quite dry. Validated, there we are, by another teacher. You could only, if you were a disciple, you could only teach what you had been taught. And you could only pass on new shmika if you had authority. You could not merely pick up the Bible and say anything you wanted. It wasn't like today, like the Western world, where you kind of go like, oh, I'm going to interpret Jeremiah 34. That's what I've just opened up to, by the way, when I flicked through. And therefore I tell you what this particular prophet is. And we get this, especially particularly in the Western church, why you get so many sects and cults. Because you get some random teacher turn up going like, I'm going to tell you exactly what, and it's usually Revelation, bless Revelations, who come along, they go like, I can tell you exactly who the beast is, or I can, we do this maths problem and we'll solve, and we go like, and we get this end of the world date, and it comes and goes and stuff. But you couldn't, in Jesus' time, you couldn't come up with new teaching. That was like something you just did not do. And you were confined by whatever your rabbi taught. And you were not permitted to teach something new that the rabbi hadn't taught unless you had been granted the authority to do this. And your new idea still had to be in accordance with all the previous teachings. But in this rabbinical system, you were only allowed to pass on teaching of your rabbi unless you had shmika. I'm really pronouncing that badly. Now, how did you receive this authority? Well, you received it by having two rabbis who already possessed this authority publicly lay their hands on you and declare that you have shmika. And the pertinent question is, did Jesus ever receive this in the Gospels? Can you recall a story where Jesus perhaps received shmika? Someone's read my notes. No, it's baptism. So, yeah, absolutely. So who's the first person to pronounce that Jesus has authority? Shmika. John the Baptist. Now the question immediately arises, so did John the Baptist possess shmika himself? Well, here's the intriguing part. There's no definitive record indicating that John received it. However, one thing that we do know is that he had, at the very least, what I might describe as a rogue shmika, because he had this following. He possessed a natural shmika, and we're told repeatedly in the Gospels that the crowds adored this man for his authority and the power of his message. So John was endowed with shmika due to who he was and the impact of his message and the importance of the obedience of his walk. That's why crowds came out to him and were baptized in the Jordan. And if you remember, we talked about how baptism what John was doing is different to what we do in Christian baptism. And it was I'm baptizing myself, and from this moment on, I'm going to follow God correctly, and I'm going to do things. So you get to watch my life. You get to see how to walk this out. And so we require a second validation. Where might that second validation come from? God the Father, absolutely. What happens at his baptism? Yeah, Holy Spirit comes down as a dove, rests on him, and a voice is heard, not just by Jesus, but by the crowds around him. This is my son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him. It's a pretty good way of getting shmika, isn't it? I wish, well, no, I don't. John and God validate Jesus' shmika. And if you ever need to wrestle with that, there's references to Jesus obtaining shmika. And one thing we can deduce from the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus certainly behaves as someone who has this authority. Absolutely. You don't simply get to say, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I say unto you, blah, 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 blah. unless you possess the authority to do it. He's living within his culture, and he's going to do stuff where it's going to rock the boat, but not so much that people are going to think that guy's a nutter. I mean, we do eventually, but you know what I mean. Now, he's following up by saying, I've got a sort of, it's not entirely brand new or out of left field, but I'm talking about things which are going to be different. Nobody has given me what I'm about to share with you. I'm stepping into this role of Shmika. I'm stepping into this role of authority, and I'm explaining how to interpret the law, how to interpret scriptures appropriately. And in fact, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, there's a passage we're skipping ahead to. Don't worry, we'll cover it properly when we get there. However, there's a verse at the end of chapter 7 that concludes the Sermon on the Mount, which says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. And there's a blatant statement about how amazed they were. They all look at each other and say, wait a minute, how can he do this? Where did he get this authority, this Shmika, from? Does he even have the authority to teach like this? Because he can't do it without having received that authority. And they're astonished because he teaches as if he possesses Shmika, as if he possesses this. He's not a typical teacher. And he's stepping into a role they never realized he had. And now what I love about that is I have some notes here. I want to read them because I've tried to choose my words quite carefully. As we pointed out previously, Jesus is trying to make the case that he's not teaching something other than Torah. Instead, he claims to be showing the world how we were supposed to read it. And according to rabbinical claims of Jesus as a teacher, his teachings of Torah is what God was really after when the law was given at Sinai. And this is important because it shows God is not here to change game plans. He's not here to do away with the Jews or take their place. He's here to throw the blinds open to what was always true. And Jesus is here to clean up our understanding. And this is actually more profound than a wrestling match than we might realize. And I believe that when we listen to Jesus' teaching, many Christians react by saying, man, that's deep, that's profound. And what a great, he's a great moral teacher and whatever. That's so mystical, so rabbinical, that's Jewish. And I don't really know what that means. And we tend to regard Jesus' teaching as a great concept to ponder on and just think about, rather than the teachings possessing significant authority. And our Western perspective contrasts with the Eastern origins. And we Brits, we're Brits, aren't we? And he is Jewish and a Jewish rabbi. And consequently, we find ourselves thinking, oh, wow, Jesus and his teaching. But we place them in a peculiar, weird category in our heads. And instead of recognizing them as teachings of our rabbi that need to be walked out and lived out, we kind of go, oh, we just get to meditate on that and, become a sunbeam or whatever it is. There's a teacher, slightly controversial teacher nowadays, but there's a guy called Brian McLaren, a bit like Rob Bell. I like his early stuff. I mean, he goes off the rails. This is from his early stuff. But he says this, he says, Christians have made Jesus their savior, but Paul their Lord. And I think that's quite often true. We look at Paul's epistles and go like, this is how we're meant to live. Now, Paul, you're doing it wrong. Paul at one point says, you want to know how to follow Jesus, follow me. And that's true, and that's good. And we should. And I would say, I've talked about duckling discipleship before, haven't I? Does that ring a bell? Yeah? That, Jesus is the mother duck, and we're all ducklings following us. We just stay one step ahead and get other people to follow us. And that's true. And I think Paul would say that's absolutely right. But quite often we think Paul's the blueprint. He's not. Jesus is the blueprint for our lives. Jesus is the one that we're trying to emulate. Jesus is the one who's using us to build his kingdom. Thing is, Paul's just a bit easier to understand because he's Paul. And he writes a lot. and uses a lot of words. And even then, sometimes he's quite difficult and stuff. But there's a lot of stuff that's easier than Jesus, because Jesus uses all this metaphor and imagery and pictures. But like I said, Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. And that's a big wrestling match to chew on. And we must confront the authority of Jesus and the gospel accounts, and everything a follower of Jesus interprets in the Bible must be viewed through the lens of Jesus. It's not rocket science. We know this, but we sometimes go like, we'll just look through it through Paul. It's just a bit easier. But let's look through it through Jesus. And when Jesus says, listen to this, he indicates that the right way to interpret the text is love. Love God and love others. And you are compelled to read the Bible through that lens. And as a follower of Rabbi Jesus, you do not have the option to disagree with it. To go like, actually, we'll love these people because they're really easy, but we'll cast shade over them because they're a lot harder to love. We'll love these people over here because they're kind of like us, but those over there, nah. They smell a bit. You don't have to. I don't have shmika in the slightest little bit. I don't even think I'm pronouncing the word properly. Jesus maintained all the shmika in the Great Commission. We touched on this on Easter Day. He says, all authority on heaven and on earth is mine. So go. Whose is the authority? Jesus's, isn't it? So go. Jesus says, I don't give it away. Thank you very much. It's my authority. But we are not permitted to teach something new outside of the lens of Jesus. Jesus is our interpretation. No amount of chutzpah grants us the ability to teach outside of the authority of Jesus. And there's loads of people who do. And I probably do at times, but I hope I don't. I hope I recognize that when I'm drifting off course. But whatever part of Scripture we are looking at, we need to consider that whatever interpretation of the book is, it must be aligned with Jesus' yoke of love God and love people. And Jesus stated that all the laws and the prophets are understood through that lens. Full stop. Paul asserts that all the teachings of the Scriptures depend on the commandment to love others. Consider the book of Joshua and what that encompasses, and particularly the challenge of conquest that we sort of unpacked when we looked at Joshua. But ultimately, the book of Joshua is fundamentally about loving people. That's how we must interpret it. It's a challenge. And whatever we are meant to glean from the book of Joshua should be encouraged. We should be encouraged to love people. And as follower of Jesus, I have absolutely no other option. I work, we all pursue, we all claim to be followers of Jesus, and we work under this shmika of our rabbi. It is this wisdom and authority that when we live it out brings transformation because it aligns our lives with the law of heaven. And it's incredible and beautiful. And do you know what? I long to see, I hope we all do. I hope we all long to see the transformation of Washington, of Sunderland, of the Northeast. That comes from living out this. Of making sure that we interpret this stuff correctly. Interpret the word of God correctly. Have the right thoughts. But those thoughts lead to the right actions. And we do it through that lens of loving God passionately and loving people passionately. That might seem a bit heavy. The good news is that actually Jesus says at some point, he says, come to me all who are weary, for my yoke is light. In comparison to every single other teaching in the world, this is light. Love. Love. Live this stuff out, and you'll find freedom. Live this stuff out, and you will bring freedom and liberty, real liberty. You'll see healing. You'll see miracles break out. We'll jump onto this quiet revival that's being talked about in the secular press, never mind Christian world. And people will see you and your good deeds, and they'll give praise to your Father in heaven. That's what we're told to do. That's what living it out is all about. But it starts with this relationship with Jesus. And it might be that you've never done that. You've never said a yes. You've never responded to that call, to that friendship, to living under this authority, to living under his kingdom, of knowing him as king, as Lord, as rabbi, as teacher, as friend. You get to do that today. There's no magic words or anything like that. It's just a simple, he says, follow me. Yeah, I'll follow you. That's all it is. Whether you're here in this room, whether you're watching online, live, or in the future. You don't need to have it all worked out. We get to live and grow together. He works it out for us. He is our blueprint. We get to model our lives on him.